Drodzy Państwo, mam zaszczyt przywitać Państwa na spotkaniu.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of welcoming you to the meeting organized by the University of Kansas and the Janusza Kurtyka Foundation. I'm very pleased to welcome all of the experts today, and first and foremost, the authors of the books that we are talking about today. And we would like to welcome Professor Chwalba and Dr. Markowski. Professor Chwalba is an author of the book, The People of Poland at War, 1914-1918. And Dr. Markowski is the author of the book for Lviv, Two Uprisings in 1918. And those books have been translated from the Polish language into the English language, and they have been published by our foundation and by Petlang Publishing House in the English language, and they are currently available. But today's meeting, although we have the authors together with us and we have the books with us today, but all of that would not have been possible without kind cooperation with the University of Kansas. Therefore, would like to welcome Professor Nathaniel Wood from this university and Dr. Eric Scott, who have kindly accepted our invitation to work together. We have developed the concept of the meeting tonight. We also have chosen a topic for this meeting, and it seems to be quite interesting because it will give us a possibility of undertaking this ambitious task of juxtaposing past with present. And the books by our authors speak about the beginning of the 20th century. We're talking about the events in Poland and Ukraine in 1914 to 1918. There is this impression, we have this feeling that this history will tell us more about what is happening today in the context of the war that is being waged against Ukraine. And as far as all substantive matters are concerned, we're going to talk about that more together with our hosts from the University of Kansas and our authors. But before that happens, I would like to give the floor to a representative of our organization, to Dr. Damian Dybnowski, the Deputy President of our foundation, who will make a brief introduction to our project. So he will talk about those two books, why those particular books have been translated into the English language. So, Doctor, over to you. And please tell us more about the project. Thank you, Łukasz, for this nice introduction and for this those nice words of welcome, warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at yet another meeting organized within the framework of the flagship project of the Janusza Kurtyka Foundation in Warsaw. That is the project under the title the Janusza Kurtyka Award, and our foundation has organized this project right from the very beginning of our activities for a number of simple reasons. Anyone who follows closely development of Polish historiography and the evolution of Polish historiography shall undoubtedly see that since the early beginnings, the Polish historiography has been developing in line with the development of the Western historiography, hence the conclusion that the scientific potential of Polish historians and of Polish science of history is in line with the world standards. It does not deviate from the world standards, but many times a principal barrier for learning about the output of the Polish historiography is the language barrier. Therefore, our foundation has organized a competition that is the Janusza Kurtyka Foundation Award. This project is based on a competition that is an open and transparent competition, and we select the best historical work in a given year that is that is linked with the main message and with the main topic of the current edition of the competition in the given year. So we, back in 2018 and in 2019, during the second and the third editions of the competition, 2 books won the award. One book by Professor Andrzej Chwelba, that is The People of Poland at War, 1914 to 19. Next year, the laureate was Dr. Markowski and his book under the title War for Lviv, 2 uprisings in 1918. And a form of the award means that the Janusza Foundation provides for the translation of the winning book into the English language. And there is a possibility of translating the books in other Congress languages, and then such monography is published by an academic publishing house of great esteem and repute. And thus, the foundation has started cooperating with a German publishing house, Peterland. The Peterland publishing house has already published 4 books. Those are books by Professor Chwalba and Dr. Markowski, and the books have already been translated and published in the English language and in the German language. And those are the 2 books that we are going to talk about today. Another type of the award is the organization of a very complex distribution system for those books. And here we cooperate with a number of publishing houses that publish our books, but also we organize the distribution of books on the basis of miscellaneous projects and initiatives that we run together with our partners. We also organize promotional meetings, lectures, sessions. We organize scientific seminars during which our laureates have a possibility of speaking about their books, and they have a possibility of sharing their knowledge with the scientific community. And this is how they can also disseminate knowledge about their research. And this is how we have been developing our cooperation with foreign Western scientific institutions. But also we have established intensive cooperation with the Polish diaspora organizations. As you know, the Polish diaspora is very active. We can rely on it. And this has been very well seen in our cooperation with the Polish diaspora organization. So I would like to thank the representatives of the Kansas University for being open and for having accepted our invitation to organize this meeting. Professor Nathan Wood, Dr. Esser, and Dr. Eric Scott have been most open and very eager to work with us, and we are very grateful for your kind cooperation with us. And those of you who are with us tonight online, I would like to wish you good intellectual feast. And I do hope that, and I'm sure that our authors shall be most interesting for you. Many thanks. Thank you for your kind introduction. As far as our project is concerned, just let me add that the translation of those books and the publication of those 2 books and the promotion of those books have been financed by the funds from the Ministry of Education and Science of the Republic of Poland within the international project, the internationalization of Polish historiography of Polish historiography and dissemination of the recognition of Polish scholarly achievements by enhancing readers' accessibility through translation and promotion of the best books conducted by the Janusza Foundation. So that's all as far as the introduction is concerned, and undoubtedly we would all need some substantive introduction. So let's talk about this subject matter that is multifaceted. And this is the topic that is also important from the point of view of today's events. And therefore, I would like to give the floor to Professor Natalia Wood.
In case it's not obvious already, you can go down to the bottom and choose the language that you'd like to listen to this presentation in. So we have simultaneous translation. It's very impressive. I congratulate for organizing this panel. As we work through our process of organizing the panel with the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Kansas, and our contact Łukasz Plosky at the Kurtyki Foundation, we decided that it would make sense for me to offer some context for the two prize-winning books we have on offer today for our English-speaking audience. So before Professor Chwalba and Dr. Markowski talk about their books, if you would permit me to offer two personal anecdotes and a little bit of scholarly analysis. So first of all, when I was in graduate school, I recall reading the memoir of Jan Słomka, who was the mayor of Dzików, just outside of Tarnobrzeg, near the border with Russian Poland, and was astonished at his description of the First World War. Growing up in an English-speaking context, my understanding of the First World War was largely dictated by the English language materials, especially that focused on trench warfare and sort of British war poets. And so it was really amazing for me to see Jan Słomka, as the mayor of this village, talk about changing loyalty and his experience as troops moved back and forth across his village on the front lines. The Austrian army was received with open arms early on, and then when the Russian army came through, the Russian officer treated him with great respect, and there was some violence towards the Jews in the village, but for the most part, the professional Russian army still acted professionally. This was very early in the war, in the fall of 1914. Conditions got worse, including when the Hungarian Honved, so from his own country's army, from Austrian Galicia, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when the Honved came through, they treated these citizens very roughly, as if they were occupying a foreign country. And Słomka was arrested and thrown into prison and threatened with execution. And Słomka, at the end of the war, after going through lots of shortages and suffering, lost his loyalty for the Habsburg Empire. At the beginning of the war, he was able to be a patriotic Pole and a loyal Habsburg citizen. And by the end, he removed his cross of merit and threw it down and said, "Send this back to Vienna." And he was fully on the side of Polish independence. And this really intrigued me, this transition, due to the experience of the war itself. A second anecdote: when I was in Krakow conducting research for my book, my dissertation and book, at which time I also had the pleasure of meeting Professor Chwalba. It's very good to see you here today, Professor Chwalba. One of my pastimes for pleasure was to go into the bookstores and look at books in the history section of the bookstores in Krakow. And as I recall, the sections on World War II were massive, multiple shelves, top to bottom. On the People's Republic of Poland, the communist era, more and more books each time I went back. And on the First World War, it was usually just a small section on one shelf. And so there's clearly was a shortage in scholarship on the First World War. And there are reasons for this, as both of these books illustrate very well. For one, Polish speakers fought on opposing sides. So it was very hard to commemorate their suffering at the end of the war, because they had fought for these empires that no longer existed. Two, through the national lens, the war was seen as the beginning for the restoration of the Polish state. It mattered, therefore, for what happened on November 11th, 1918. But again, as I said a moment ago, it was very hard to commemorate the huge loss of life, the problems with hygiene and health and supply of food, and with disease, typhus and tuberculosis, the influenza at the end of the war, and with the violence of troops passing through villages, requisitioning things from the local citizens. That was very difficult, unlike, say, in France or or Great Britain, where it was much easier to commemorate the war itself. In Poland, it was much harder to come to terms with this. And so sometimes it takes a centennial. And so with the anniversary of the Great War, and now with the fighting that occurred immediately after the war, a number of scholars have taken up this subject. Among them, the two scholars that we have with us today. Wonderful scholarship in multiple languages now on Warsaw by Robert Blobaum, who's one of our attendees today. Bartosz Ogórek, a young scholar in Krakow, wrote an amazing book called Niezatarte Piętno, an indelible mark, about the demographic legacies of the First World War in Krakow. Kamil Luszawa has recently published Galicki Exodus, about the refugees who left Galicia during the war. Włodzimierz Borodziej and Maciej Gorny have published a 2-volume series called Nasza Wojna about the Second World War. The First World War. Alexander Watson's Ring of Steel in English about Germany and Austria-Hungary has extensive coverage of the war in Austria and Galicia and in the German-controlled territories. Robert Gervarth's The Vanquished, Why the First World War Failed to End, offers a very good analysis of the civil war that erupted in the period that Dr. Markowski is writing about in The Battle for Lviv. And Jochen Böhler, another German scholar, has published Civil War of Poland, 1918 to 1921. And these texts all draw our attention to the real horror of warfare in a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual space. And this is a problem that's really hard to grapple with, because as I tell my students in my World War I class, the mere existence of diversity doesn't breed violence, but violence in the context of diversity means that existing divisions can become fissures. So the ways that people interacted or simply lived side by side, as Dr. Markowski writes about in Forces for Conflict, when there's political instability and warfare. So these books do an excellent job of trying to unpack and help us to understand this complicated time and this complicated period. I'm very grateful to each of the scholars and to the Kurtyki Foundation for translating these books and making them available to me and to my students in my World War I class. These will be great resources for us going forward. And I'm excited to hear each of our authors today talk a bit about their books and about their contemporary relevance. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy panie profesorze za to wprowadzenie.
Professor, thank you very much for this introduction. There is just one thing that I can do, is to give the floor to the authors of the books that we're going to discuss today. Professor Andrzej Chwarba. Sir, would you be so kind as to take the floor? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Professor Nathaniel Dewood. Yes, indeed. We have met, and we met in Krakow, and we discussed a number of issues. Not necessarily, though, the Great War itself, the war of 1914-1918. So it is actually good that this subject, which is so important for Europe and the world, we can return to it. Now, it's hard to disagree with you, Professor. This war was the kind of experience that has become quite memorable. You have given such an example, this gentleman, that actually showcases the situation rather well. And yes, it is true that until 2010, 2012, here in Poland, hardly any works were published on that subject. And if you look at the French language, German language, English language works, you will see that the shelves are heavy with works on World War I. When you look at bookstores in Paris, you will see that they are packed with works on that subject. Why? Because France won that war, and France prefers to describe that war rather than World War II, because they would rather not remember World War II all too well, and they connect that experience of World War II with Vichy. Only French presidents, starting with Mitterrand, resulted in the French actually more willingly speak of World War II. Now, the British are quite happy to talk about the Great War. It is after World War II that their empire begins to fall apart. But there is also another thing that's true. The empire after World War I is weaker than it was before the outbreak of the war. This is, you can see it clearly, the beginning of the end of the empire. Now, the insightful British politicians could actually see that the war accelerated this process of certain nations, especially in Asia, maturing, and those nations will quite soon ask and demand to be granted a completely different status. On the 100th anniversary of the war, I published this war, Samobójstwo Europy, that could be translated as Europe's suicide. Part of it was published in English, I believe, 1914, 1918, An Anatomy of Global Conflict. So, the year 1914 was, or rather, 2014 was the beginning of this century of study. Dr. Gurek also wrote a great book. Dr. Ruszawa wrote another one. By the way, in a few days, he will receive an award for that very work. Generation of historians, and they are looking at things that were not looked at before. They're doing their homework, so to speak. Better and better do we realize what this war was all about. We historians, the Polish historians and others, we were mostly focused on the year 1914, and we looked at mostly at orientations. In other words, what was the Polish orientation in 1914? Who to support, who to oppose? We concentrated on the Polish legions, the Polish volunteer formations, which did participate in the war, and we also concentrated on 1918. So we did not concentrate on the war itself. We knew hardly anything about the war proper. Let's look at the Polish lands. Around 5 million people had to leave the Polish land. Out of 13, we are talking about Belarusians, Poles, Jews, and others. Some left and traveled to Russia. Basically, Russia was conducting the scorched land policy. So, and they also basically stole industrial base. And so in 1918, what we see is hard to imagine, but we have to imagine that. When you look at the Polish factories, Polish plants in Warsaw and other major cities, they were stripped of everything. What you saw there were walls, and there was nothing on the inside. All the equipment, all the machines, all the prefabs, everything had been simply taken away. So robbery was taking place, which was a result of the war. But another thing that should be mentioned are certain changes, civilizational changes that did take place. Some of those changes were not really welcome, were they? Today, you see something that is, quite common. At 10 p.m., lights are off, and it is something that the Germans introduced in 1915. Here, it's common at the time. It was new. And another thing that they were introduced was about the dogs, because dogs would attack German soldiers, and those dogs were supposed to be chained. And the Polish peasants actually are not quite happy with that. They claim that it's the change in how Poles behave. It was about collecting waste. And today, there is this EU policy to collect general waste. I mean, metal and plastic and glass. It is something that was introduced by the Germans as early as 1915 or 16, actually. So on the one hand, we do remember and want to remember those changes that were positive. And on the other hand, there were other practices, such as roundups, that will become common in World War II. By the way, it was not something that was invented in the 40s. Concentration camp too. Yes, you had some during the War of Lemberg, but they become quite common. There were areas encircled by barbed wire, and certain laborers that wouldn't want to work were gathered there. So were POWs. So people would be forced to produce. Basically, you saw these practices which are going to be rolled out on a larger scale during World War II. Now, the black market, for example, this was an opportunity to survive. You mentioned, Professor, that people remember destruction. The scale of destruction there was incomparable to what you saw in the West, because there you had war, a trench war, positional war rather. And when you had positional war, when sites stayed in the same places, you had immense destruction. In this part of Europe, war was more mobile, and that meant that fronts would move eastwards and westwards. Towns, villages, largely with houses made of wood, would be often destroyed. So it is something that is remembered. You see bombs being dropped, infrastructure is being destroyed in the east, in Ukraine. Today, Poles are remembering their experience from World War II. They are remembering their experience from World War I. So you have two wars. Times change, and yet wars are quite similar to one another. Civilians simply get penalized for that. Back then, civilians during World War I were not the target of destructions, unlike in World War II. But even back in World War I, they paid a heavy price. Now, the Polish vision, 1917, 1918, we see a breakthrough. The old European architecture, dominated by the greatest European powers and dynasties, is history. Goes away. Countries collapse. You see revolutions. Poles, like some other European nations, are looking for a way to solve this situation. They have certain hopes. They hope that they'll be able to set up their own countries, national states. However, to set up such a national state in an area where the picture, ethnic-wise, is so complex, so complicated, was by no means an easy task.
It's not like with the borders between the Netherlands and Germany, where the political border is at the same time the ethnical border, or like between Norway or Sweden. It was not the case here, because here we had many peoples moving around from place to place for centuries. So this constant movement for centuries meant that within the same place, we would have representatives of 2 or 3 confessions, or representatives of 4 to 5 different ethnic groups. So how to delineate borders in such conditions? So as far as the territories that used to be the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, there we had the formation of different nations: Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. And the level of national advancement was rather complex. And Dr. Markowski is undoubtedly going to speak about Ukraine, he's going to talk about Lviv and Kiev centers. They were different in their own right. And that was also the result of differences between the Austrian and Russian legal systems. Already then, Russia was questioning the individual character of the Ukrainian people. For that, they thought that Ukrainians were not Ukrainians, but Russians. And if we today look at the today's stance of the Russian Orthodox Church, then we can clearly see that nothing has changed. The Moscow Patriarchate, back in the past, but also today, is of the opinion that some tribes, as they used to say, that is Belarusian or Ruthenian tribes, or Ruthenian or Ukrainian tribes, this is how they were calling them, that they are not, in fact, political beings in their own right. They're not ethnic formations in their own right. So Russian Orthodox Church, being a state organ, has been a tool in the political activities of the Russian Empire. And it actually cannot be otherwise if you know the history of the Russian Empire. Therefore, the center in Kiev, Ukrainian center, was not developing very fast, and the peasants who living in those territories, they did not have this sense of having their own political entity. But with Belarus, the situation is even more complex than that, because the entire territory of Belarus was controlled by Russia, which means that Russia was doing everything they could do to give Belarusians no chance for developing as a nation. Now, the Catholic Church was very much weakened after the national uprisings, and the Catholic Church was gave the ground for the development of Polish culture, but also gave the ground for the development of Belarusian culture. And the most famous teachers, writers, and Belarusian thinkers, those were followers of the Catholic Church. And that is due to the fact that the Catholic Church is a universal church. And as far as the Orthodox Church is concerned, they had to follow the policy that resulted from the autocephalic nature of the church: one nation, one people, one religion. So if you're an Orthodox, then you're Russian, full stop. Therefore, it was very difficult for a few Belarusian Catholics to think of independence. And that's why the Belarusian state that was born in 1918 had so many difficulties, found it so very difficult to survive, just like the Ukrainian People's Republic or the Kiev Center that was also established in 1918, practically speaking. And after the Bolshevik coup, or actually even before the February Revolution, the Ukrainian nationhood was being born, but neither Ukrainians nor the White Russians nor the Red Russians were not accepting the formation of Ukraine. So the white forces were accepting the Western point of view, and actually those were the Americans, French, and the English who thought that Ukraine should be a part of Russia. They did not see any other option. The Ukrainian People's Republic was recognized by Poland, but it was also partially recognized by Finland, Romania, and by Latvia. However, other countries refused recognizing the Ukrainian People's Republic. So that actually shows how difficult it was a case for Western alliance. And yes, they heard about the Poles in the past, so they heard about Polish uprisings, so Polish kept on reminding of their existence. However, Ukrainians and Belarusians were new nation states, therefore they were not yet given a chance. That is, the allied politicians and commanders did not give those new two republics a chance to prove their existence. So that was a very difficult territory, a very difficult area to take into consideration and to take decisions about. So the Belarusian and Ukrainian options actually lost. Some Belarusians decided to unite with the Bolsheviks. Other Belarusians decided to unite with the Poles. Likewise with the Ukrainians. Some Ukrainians decided to unite with Lenin and Trotsky, and the nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, eventually decided to unite forces with the Poles. However, later on, it turned out that the Polish option was all too weak. It was not strong enough to provide Ukraine with independence or to provide Belarus with independence. At most, the Poles could defend their own independence, but they were in no position to impose on the Russians the will to recognize the nationhood of the Ukrainians and the Belarusians. So Belarusians and Ukrainians today are back in 1918. Because that is the foundational myth for those two countries. And Alexander Lukashenko is makes some references to the hymn and to the flag, but in fact there are some references also to the hymn and to the flag from the First World War. Therefore, indeed, this is a reference point also for modern Belarus and for modern Ukraine. And without those points of reference, neither Belarus nor Ukraine would have this strong constitutional element. Therefore, 1918 is a very important year, and this is why the Kremlin policy is trying to eradicate the awareness about 1918, and they are trying to remove 1918 from the narrative in Belarus and in Ukraine, and they're trying to impose their own narrative, and their narrative is the war and annexation. That's all. Thank you very much. My time is over. Over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting lecture, and let us move on to Dr. Damian Markowski. Dr. Markowski, thank you. Professors, ladies and gentlemen, it is with utmost pleasure that I'm going to speak to you today about my book, but in more general terms, we're going to talk about the history of conflicts. What are the lessons of the history of conflicts, and what are the lessons that we can draw from the Polish-Ukrainian conflict that unfolded 104 years ago? Now, to be somewhat provocative, you might have heard about Netflix releasing a new series based on the book by Remarque, that is All Nothing Changes on the Western Front. This movie is somewhat weaker, it's not as good as the previous movie. Nonetheless, we see the war through the eyes of a front-line soldier, as is the case in that particular movie. But it is not that often that we see this destruction of the war from the point of view of society, how the war affects economic ties, social ties, how the war affects relations between ethnic and religious groups. We do not often see how the war affects all those who live behind the front line. So we do not actually see much and understand and know much about what is happening behind the front line. And once again, I would like to thank Dr. Rushala from Krakow for his great book about Galicia during the world wars. But I may say that initially my book was not meant to be about Lviv or Lviv two uprisings. I simply wanted to write the end of history of a certain city. Because in my book, I do describe combat operations. I do describe the fights between the two clearly identified armed groups. So on the one hand, we have the army of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, and on the other side, the Polish units that were gradually becoming a part of the renewed Polish army. So I do describe the struggle between Poland and Ukraine. But then, on the other hand, there is another drama going on, something that is not yet so clearly seen. This is the drama of thousands, I would dare say, of millions of links, relations between different peoples and families and citizens. And there was so much going on between those who lived in the same building and the same street, and all those bonds and ties were severed by those tragic events that were unfolding in the streets of the city of Lviv or Lviv. And many of those relations were being redefined, both Poles and Ukrainians and the Jews and the Armenians and so many others. Ethnical groups, they had to somehow face the new events that were unfolding in front of their own eyes. They had to opt in or out. They had to actually say whether they're fighting for Ukraine or Poland. So in 1918, the 31st of October was still a calm day. That was the last day of the old Austro-Hungarian Lemberg. And Polish underground organizations were already getting ready to get power in the city, to fight for power. They were waiting for the arrival of the delegation of the Polish authorities, and they were expecting the delegation from Poland to come, from Krakow to come. But then on the other hand, the Ukrainian side decided to out at night from the 31st of October to the 1st of November, overnight, as a result of a military action organized by the Ukrainian conspirators, conspiracy members who actually were capable of taking power fairly quickly, and this is how they announced the establishment of land was meant to unite with the Great Ukraine, that is Ukraine over the banks of the Dnieper River. Now, why two uprisings? So once the Ukrainian uprising broke out, it toppled the Austrian-Hungarian authorities in Lviv, and then hours later, the city streets were filled with struggle. There was a lot of fighting going on between the Ukrainian members of the uprisings that were actually in strife with each other, but still they operated as individual disparate groups of the Polish youth, school youth, and sometimes those were just the Lviv Batyary, and but still they united, and this is how the city transformed into one big battlefield.
Slowly, hundreds and thousands of volunteers joined the Polish side. At the time, there were more Poles than other nationalities in the city. It is more difficult for Ukrainians to operate in the city. They were less numerous, and basically they didn't feel very good there. They didn't know it too well. Slowly, reinforcements, Ukrainian reinforcements, do start to flow into the city, and then we have the power that is equal. The city is divided. There is a front line. It's a stalemate, if you will, and various attacks on either side end up with basically a butchery, because it is more difficult to attack, so the attackers find it very bloody. After some time, the Polish reinforcements arrive. They arrive from Przemysl, and it is then that the Poles take things under control. There is a long, hard battle that takes a whole day, and Ukrainian troops decide to leave. There is this infamous thing that happens later, namely, there is a pogrom of the Jews. At least 79 people die as a result, and a few hundred are wounded. It happens under an excuse to publish the Jews of Lemberg, because allegedly they supported the opposing party, the Ukrainians. When I was writing my book, ladies and gentlemen, I tried to look at various writings. Basically, I wanted to get a fuller picture of what the city was like, a city where battle was raging, a region where war was raging. I wanted to hear, so to speak, from all of the participants of those events. It is my belief that to some extent, I was thus able to create a book that is something more than just a description of those fights. It was my attempt to see the life, or rather the death, in this city. Ever since then, Lviv has never been actually the same. I'm not sure how to phrase that. Basically, brother turned against the brother. Families were divided because of the events that I described in my book. If somebody asked me to tell me, or rather, if somebody asked me to tell you what kind of lesson can be found there in this Polish-Ukrainian conflict, by the way, said conflict then continued because it turned into a war. Ultimately, the Ukrainian nationhood was defeated ultimately in Galicia and the region, and Lviv was taken over by Poles. So if I were to see something there, I would point out the following thing. It was a mistake of both parties to step away from the negotiating table and start to fight. And this is what I described in my book. On both sides, you had political leaders, activists that warned others, namely that this fight long term would be terrible because it would poison the relationship, the Polish-Ukrainian relationships, for many years to come. In November 1918, this is when the Polish uprising was quite successful. One of the Polish public servants, or rather political activists, issued such a warning: we must not fight Ukrainians. I'm quoting, "It is not an enemy that can be defeated. How can you have this eternal dispute with your neighbors?" Professor Chwalba said that at the time Galicia was one huge Gordian knot in terms of nationality. In Lviv, 60% of Poles, 30% Jews, 10% Ukrainians. Outside of the city, Brzuchowice, a village, 85% of Ukrainians. Another village, 90% Polish. So this is what you had, all intermingled. And Ukrainians said something similar. We must not cross the red lines. Ataman Divetsko, the Ukrainian leader, did what he could so that his soldiers would not fire at Polish civilians. He did not want this war to encompass the civilians. Unfortunately, those attempts were not entirely successful. Now, lesson number 2. This Polish-Ukrainian war showed that once blood has been spilled, it keeps coming back, and this gap is very difficult to bridge, and it gets deeper and deeper. Henryk Sienkiewicz, in one of his people's hearts, and it poisons the neighbor's blood. And basically, it fits very well what was happening in the period that I'm talking about. So, ultimately, the city was divided by hate and suspicion, and the city turned overnight almost. One of the Polish fighters wrote about that. Evil happened very quickly, and good will have to be rebuilt, and it's going to take a long time to accomplish that. Mind you, this person that I have just quoted was trying to make sure that Lviv would be a Polish city, and yet he realized that certain things cannot be undone. Now, the worst things was crimes committed on civilians, and of November, the Polish snipers would hunt Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian neighbors. On the other hand, Ukrainian troops would pacify whole Polish villages that would support the Polish uprising in Lviv. Sokolniki, I've mentioned this village already, a dozen or so people were murdered, including the mayor, a local teacher, and a priest. Now, what's paradoxical about this crime is that Sokolniki refused actively to join the fray and to send their own soldiers. They believed that it would turn the neighbors against them, their Ukrainian neighbors, and actually the reverse was true. Blood was spilled, and it was used for founding myths, both on the Polish and Ukrainian side. On the Polish side, there is this myth of united defense of Lviv. Oh, but actually it was just the selected few who defended the city. Only some Poles did that. You can read more about it in the archives of the local national police. In December and in January, people would be hunted. I mean those that did not intend to fight. But, it was kept hush-hush because those types of things do not fit in very well with the national mythos. Similarly, the crimes were not talked about. Now, when it comes to the Ukrainian mythos, there is this young Ukrainian state that was drowned by the Poles. It was later used by the Ukrainian nationalists from various organizations. Now, the third thing to remember, when it comes to Polish-Ukrainian conflicts, usually it's the third parties that benefit from it. Russia, later Bolsheviks too, or Nazi Germany. Professor, you've mentioned that. Now, ultimately, the Ukrainian statehood was ultimately destroyed by Bolsheviks. Soviets also benefited on the Polish-Ukrainian conflict to a similar degree during World War II. Ultimately, they cut through this Gordian Galician knot, and they used their own specialty, namely they started resettling people en masse. And a few more words, something positive this time. Let's look at what is happening in the eastern part of the war, where the Ukrainian country is fighting against this Russian aggression. Ukraine was granted this huge opportunity, and it is not discussed too widely either in Poland or in Western Europe. What I mean by that, there's this huge opportunity that they are looking at. They can use this pan-Ukrainian resistance to build a country that is going to be able to resist those Russian temptations. They can build a myth, a new founding myth that will have good foundations in the events that we are witnessing right now. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for your talk. Our authors have mentioned a huge number of interesting things. So this is the right moment to give the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen. We highly encourage you to ask questions. There is this Professor Nathaniel Wood, over to you, because I understand that you manage the questions and answers section rather. Professor, if you have any questions to our authors, to our guests, by all means, do chip in. Do add your own opinion. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you. I think that we have about 15 minutes now for questions, and I very much invite the questions from the audience. Or just a comment on the translation for the title of the book in English, All Quiet on the Western Front, versus the German title, which does translate to Nothing Changes on the Western Front. Aini Sweeney has asked if the speakers would like to take a step back in history and comment on the Tartarian pseudo-empire and how this ethnological entity might have influenced modern politics from the point of view of cultural and religious behaviors. Did it dissipate into the ethnic groups already present for centuries, perhaps millennia? So I think looking at a background to the ethno-linguistic and multi-confessional heritage of this region. So asking about the Tartars in particular. Would either of you like to talk about sort of the ethnic diversity from well before the war in the region of sort of Polish-Ukrainian overlap, Jewish also as well?
Czy można prosić o doprecyzowanie pierwszego?
Would you please make this question more exact? Both questions, because I don't actually understand what pseudo-empire you have in mind. I would really need to understand better the second question. What do you mean by the Tartarian pseudo-empire? So let's talk about this diversity first, perhaps, which is question number 2.
I invite our guest, Anne Sweeney, to perhaps elaborate. You're on mute. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing an opportunity for any response there. I don't know if that's just part of the setup here, but I haven't heard any response. I think we perhaps could move on to other questions, and then maybe if there's a follow-up, you could type it, or if there's a follow-up, we would be happy to try and address the question. So I have a question for our panelists. Thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you for your discussion of their relevance today. I was really taken by how both Professor Chwalba, in referring to his other book, Samobójstwo Europy, or the sort of a suicide, European suicide, and how Dr. Markowski, in talking about a civil war that destroyed a multi-ethnic space, the Lviv as it existed before the war, are thinking about this war and these conflicts as an end to something rather than a beginning. When Polish historiography talks about World War I, it's talking about the beginning of the Second Republic. But I was really intrigued to hear both of you referring to the war as the end of something. Would you please reflect a little bit more on that, how the war is an ending, not just a beginning in Polish history?
Może jeszcze odnośnie tego
Thank
pytania.
you. As for the previous question, by the way, maybe I would try to say the following. Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, since the times of the Middle Ages, consisted of many different ethnical groups and components. And in this region, we had a border between the Latin Christian world that subsequently was divided into the Catholic and Protestant worlds. And on the other hand, we had the Orthodox Christian world. And that is beginning with Croatia at the Adriatic Sea, and then through the Magyar country that is Hungary today, and going up north to the Baltic states. There was one border between the different religious denominations. Another border is the border of the Jewish settlements, the Jews that were expelled from Western Europe, from Portugal, Spain, then from France and from German lands. Those Jews were traveling to 2 countries, that is, they were moving on to the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey. But this is not actually correct, because that was the Ottoman Empire, that was very different territory, but also they were on the move to the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. So hence their large numbers in the territories of the today's Warsaw, Vilnius, Kiev, Lviv, Minsk. So there we had a high concentration of the Jewish population, but also down south in the Saloniki, we had another center of the Jewish culture. And in the West, after the expulsion of the Jews until the 18th century, the Jews were not there. Actually, they returned to those lands, but later in the 18th and 19th centuries. Therefore, again, if we look at the Jewish communities, they're also very much in conflict between themselves. There were progressives, Hasidic Jewish communities, different families, different languages. We cannot speak of one Jewish nation in the territory of Europe because of their diversity and complexity. Now, there is the third border that was dividing the Christian world from the Muslim world, Islam. In the east of Poland, in the southeast of Poland, we had the border between the expansive Turkish state, that is the Ottoman Empire, that was very expansive, and on the other hand, there was the Habsburg Empire, and Hungary became part of the Habsburg state. So all of that meant that there was a mosaic, there was an incredible mix of people, religions. It was a headache. It was an extreme headache for all those politicians who wanted to demarcate any borders in those territories. Now, as far as the Ottomans are concerned, now let me move on to the second question. The Tatars were allies of the Turks who lived in the Crimean Peninsula, but then Crimea was populated by the Russians, and the Russians populated the Crimea, who were taken to Crimea from the Russian mainland. So actually, ethnically speaking, Crimea, in their majority, was a Russian peninsula, and the Crimean Tatars, the Muslim, were in minority. Another Tatar center from the Golden Orda was in the vicinity of Kazan. This is the territory of the today's Tatarstan. Now, another interesting episode as far as the Tatars are concerned. In 1919, the Tatar parliament addressed the Polish authorities in Warsaw and addressed the Polish authorities with a plea to establish an alliance. And actually, they wanted to even tabled an idea of becoming a part of the Polish state that was being formed. So it was rather imperialistic attitude, but the Polish state had rather limited possibilities. But perhaps before I move on to the question posed by Professor Wood, I would ask Dr. Markowski to speak first. Yes, how to define, it's quite an interesting question, how to define the beginnings and the ends from the point of view of history. Well, I think that it's quite interesting to see World War I as both the end and the beginning of many different things in Europe. How about my own family book of photographs? In 1918, my grandfather took a picture. My grandfather is presented as a soldier of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Then, a few pages later, I still see my grandfather taken on the front in Italy, 1917. He's already decorated with medals. Then I see his picture in November 1918, picture taken in Lviv. He was still wearing this gray bluish uniform of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but with already blue and white and red ribbon. Then, after the Battle of Warsaw, I see a picture of him as a soldier that is a village chief in the village of Maciejówka, which is a very typical Polish village, and he is wearing a typical Polish hat. And there he is, a representative of the new reborn Republic of Poland. And it is just family album of pictures. From the point of view of politicians, setting up the ground for new reality is it's all about their work, being politicians. But from the point of view of the population, it was chaos, just chaos. But even if chaos, then that was the chaos to be expected by the local populations, different territories. For instance, we can read Professor Chwalba's book, and we can see how Poland was expected by the Poles from 3 different territories that were parts of the Poland under partitions. So those times were turbulent times of chaos, but somehow that chaos was harnessed, and somehow that chaos was gradually transformed into a shape and form of a democratic statehood, as was described by a Polish writer. She was in Warsaw in the beginning of November 1918, and she wrote the following: Poland was born out of chaos, but no one could see her true beauty at that time. And this is how I would finish, with that beautiful quote. Yes, indeed, that writer, she was a candidate to the Nobel Prize in Literature. By the way, if I may add more to this question, 1914 or 1918? Because it is important to understand what year are we talking about. We as historians, we are not talking about theoretical matters, but also practical matters. And just like Dr. Markowski, I would like to make a reference to a certain situation that took place a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, due to an understanding between Warsaw and Berlin, they started the publication history textbooks for secondary schools, like an ecumenical joint textbook about history with identical content. And this textbook was to be used both in Poland and in Germany, following suit of a similar German-French textbook. And I spoke to Mr. Hahn from Germany, and we were responsible for the chapter devoted to the 19th century. And actually, we could see eye to eye, with one exception, with one bone of contention. Shall we talk about 1914 or 1918? Because this textbook was to be an obligatory textbook, both in Poland and Germany. But then, as far as Polish textbooks are concerned, they would usually describe more the events in 1918. But the curriculum in Germany were such that they were actually ending that chapter in 1914. Now, the question is, practically speaking, how do we write a textbook that actually is not with the Polish nor with German curriculum? So we found a solution, not the best one, though. We decided to change the rules. So we thought that, okay, the victorious state, that is France, England, and the USA, were celebrating 1918. Okay, they were victorious. So this is the railway car. This is the document signed there, and that's why they say the Great War, not World War I. They say Great War because that was great victorious war for them. But as far as the Germans and the Hungarians are concerned, and Austrians, the Hungarians in particular say that their epoch ended in 1914, and beginning with 1914, they had a beginning of a new epoch. So you can see that the point of view depends on the point of sitting, as they say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question? I would love to get more questions from our audience for our authors today. Thank you for those excellent answers. Well, I don't know if we've arrived at an ending. We had a great beginning, a great middle, And now we might be at the ending. Let's see. Oh, Professor Blowbaum has posed a question. Excellent. Just a second. Yes, he asks, perhaps the authors could also address continuities. For the war, and in fact, was intensifying on the eve of the war. The same with anti-Semitism. Could it not be said that the war, its brutality, simply accelerated, exacerbated, and radicalized these conflicts?
Tak, mogę rozpocząć?
May I begin? If you allow, because I'm sure that you'll supplement it beautifully later. Yes, by all means. The war doesn't only bring destruction. You have those masses of troops that participate. You have civilians participating too, and people who used to be the subject of history become, rather objects become their subjects, and they present their own needs. They are taken out of their own world. This old world that they had lived in is destroyed, and new questions are asked. Questions pertaining their ethnicity. Who am I in this war? What is my identity? Why am I on this side of the war rather than on the other side? Why would I be on this side? Is it my war to begin with? So people ask themselves those questions. They look for answers. They are trying to see who is guilty, who is responsible for the fact that this is my house was destroyed, that the prices are outrageous and speculative, and that landowners, house owners, landlords, in other words, are making outrageous amounts of money. Why cannot we rebuild the walls? I cannot do that because I can afford, or rather I cannot afford to buy, be it bricks or timber. People feel this hate, this despise, and then it's channeled largely by the politicians, and it's channeled against other ethnicities. So in 1914, let's say that the level of anti-Semitism was 100, but then some time later it was 150. Now, the Baltic states, due to the occupiers, but also rise of tensions between the poor and the rich. Jews were quite often rich, which is why peasants would attack Jews, but they would also attack magnates, the aristocracy, priests. People are murdered, their assets are taken away. People who have anything that they don't want to share are attacked and quite often killed. At the end of the war, there is this vacuum of power. The old power is gone or is going away, and there is nobody at time for those who would like to benefit from that, or alternatively, who would like to make up for all the losses that they had suffered throughout the war. And that is, you see, that is why you see those rising tensions. So coming back to the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, it is not only about Lviv in 2018. Let's look at the Treaty of Brest. This is very important for the Polish-Ukrainian relations. So when it comes to the relationship with the western part. So basically Galicia is supposed to divide it into two parts, the Ukrainian part with Lviv, Lvov, and the western part with Kraków. Now, the land close to Lublin, the disputed lands, are supposed to go to Ukraine, even though Poles form a majority there. Now, the central want the Ukrainian grains and horses and cattle, and thus they grant lands to Ukrainians where Poles live, and that leads to conflicts. In 1918, this conflict, this tension is there, it's ready. And in November, you have more events, and I believe my colleague has already talked about, and he is going to add something to it, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you for the first part of the answer. Thank you for the excellent question, and thank you for a great answer there too. I'll go a step further here. I naturally agree with what both professors have said. Let me add something here. Let's talk about the scale of the conflict, of the crimes and atrocities that were committed, the scale of the hate that I covered in my book. I mean here 1918 and 1919 to some extent. Basically, it was a drop in the sea of blood that was shed. So this was a flywheel, if you will, not the first one, as you have rightly mentioned, but unfortunately, neither was it the last one. Why so? Let's look at, and Ukrainians altogether lost around 2,000 civilians that were killed or murdered by the other side. But in the 40s, it was well over 100,000, mostly Poles, but also partly Ukrainians. So there is this conflict of memory, those conflicted memories that has been going on, and it continues to some extent. Only to some degree is it linked to what happened in Lviv. It is much more closely linked to what happened in Volhynia, to the atrocities committed against Poles there. And it is also linked to the Ukrainian losses in Poland after World War II. Thank you. Excuse me. I believe, I'm not sure if I understood right, Professor. Robert Blobaum is with us. Am I right in assuming that he's with us? Is he with us? If so, we know Robert's books. Hello. We know his books about the World War, and I remember the excellent lecture that he gave. It doesn't really matter where. It was here in Krakow at the university. So best regards, Professor.
Thank you all. Thank you for your questions and for your comments. Thank you for the things to think about. Dr. Markowski, I'm particularly grateful for your comment about the current war in Ukraine, the similarities and the differences, the chances to build a new founding myth for Ukrainians, and the lessons learned of how horrific civil warfare and warfare in general in a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multilingual space can be. With this, I would like to turn our time back over to the foundation and to Łukasz, and thank you all so much for attending and for participating.
Drodzy Państwo, ja się przyłączam do tej sesji podziękowań.
May I also join you in saying thank you to Professor Wood for having accepted our invitation. Thank you for your moderation. Thank you for involvement, and thank you to our authors. Yet again, I have listened to our guests' talks, and they are always extremely interesting. I would also like to thank all of the participants. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you for the questions. Ethra Pedalak, Dr. Scott, thank you, because you have been a part of the whole event. Thank you for your efforts, for your help, and all the best to Kansas from Poland. Best regards. I can see Dr. Predolak, Dr. Eric Scott. Would you like to take the floor? If so, by all means, do so.
Just quickly, I wanted to say thank you very much for joining us for this event, particularly since I do know in Poland it's rather late in the evening, and we look forward to further cooperation with you. It's really exciting to connect with historians across time and space and linguistic borders as well. I'm also very thankful for the interpreters for their great job throughout the presentation. So thank you all for coming.
Bardzo dziękujemy. Drodzy Państwo, w takim razie kończymy spotkanie.
Thank you. Let us finish this meeting. Thank you very much, and see you at other events. Goodbye.